Welcome to another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. This has got to be 200 or plus, I don't know, somewhere in there, but it's a lot of them. And I've continually worked on kind of starting at the periphery and bit by bit working more into the core in terms of understanding health and illness and therapies, etc., etc. And there's a lot of them out there. However, today I've chosen a subject that we brought up on and off and probably referred to it frequently, but I want to look at it a little more in depth and some of the considerations that have to do with the path to health, which is inflammation. Now, I'm well aware that most people consider inflammation to be an enemy, and there are many, many books written that talk about inflammation being the cause of illness, etc., etc. However, inflammation is a natural process in the body, and it certainly is not the cause of any illness, but rather the result of illness. And so we're going to talk a bit more about that today in terms of getting a bit more into the process and the purpose of the process. Now, behind all this, actually inflammation is one of the phases of homotoxicology. And I've mentioned on many occasions homotoxicology, and way back along the way I did either a 2 or 3 day session broadcast on homotoxicology, the development of it, and most of the implications of it. So once you look at this material that we're talking about today, you may want to go back and review the whole process. I will say it had its beginning with a German doctor by the name of Hans Heinrich Reckeweg, and he was an MD who became a specialist in toxicology, especially from drugs, but of other toxins, and eventually was introduced to homeopathic medicine and ultimately made a major change in his therapeutic approach and also in understanding the process of getting sick and getting well. Every time that I have reviewed that with the patient, even if not in great depth, their comment always has been, well, that makes sense. And it really does. In fact, all aspects of the body function, getting ill or sick and getting well, all make sense if you understand how the body does it. The problem is that we have come up with a hodgepodge cookbook of names of groups of symptoms that we call diseases, and we've come up with a hodgepodge of treatments to suppress every one of these so-called diseases or illnesses. But it kind of reminds me in some respects of the man from Macho, the story of the man who went out to fight windmills because he thought he was actually engaging in battle. And so we could liken these illnesses, these diagnoses that have been developed as straw men, and that we then set out to defeat the straw man, but has nothing to do with the reality of what's going on. After having studied this whole concept of health and illness and medicine and so forth for in excess of 40 years, and having reviewed the last 200 years of medicine, pharmacology, health, sickness, diet, etc., I believe that I've come to understand it fairly well, Don't say I know all the answers, but let's say I think I have a pretty good understanding of the processes that are going on in the body, and hence what you can do to aid the body in healing itself. Now notice I said healing itself. Years ago there was a book written by Dr. Glasser called The Body is the Hero. I've mentioned it before. I don't know if anyone it's still available. I don't know if anyone has decided to read the book, but he was at the time a renowned medical doctor immunologist. And he's the one that made the comment that there may be once or twice in someone's life that they might need antibiotics. But the tons of antibiotics that are prescribed every year are not only worthless, they're actually contributing to the problem. Now, I know that antibiotics have been touted as the miracle, and only because medicine had nothing before, and now they came up with something that would suppress symptoms, i.e. inflammation and other symptoms. And consequently, everybody thought that medicine had came up with the answer and could solve anything. Now, it's interesting because Glasser ultimately, and he was a consultant to the World Health Organization relating to immunology, and he said that the body ultimately does the healing no matter what you do. If it gets healed at all, it's going to be the body that does it. And that all of these antibiotics that are being prescribed are recklessly and irresponsibly administered, and that in the long run they have not helped the health situation at all. So it's not me, but Dr. Glasser who made those comments, and there's a lot of other material out there, but that's beyond what we want to talk about today, only as it relates to inflammation. Inflammation is interesting, and there's probably not anyone that hasn't heard the term inflammation and probably has experienced it at some time or the other, or maybe frequently, or in a few cases maybe ongoing, because no one has figured out what is going on in the body that has provoked the inflammation. Okay, so the word itself really means a flame inside. And really, it's not a flame per se, but it is heat. And the reason it's heat is because of a concentration of blood at a certain area, which raises the temperature of that tissue that has become engorged with more blood, and it's all part of a process. So we're going to talk about that in more detail. But unfortunately, there's so many misconceptions about inflammation. Number one is, of course, most people think it's bad. And they don't like it because it makes them feel uncomfortable. And so they think that anything that will shut down the inflammation has solved the problem because they feel better. Now, I've probably emphasized it 1,000 or maybe more times that you cannot measure health or illness strictly on the basis of symptoms, especially if the symptoms are being generated by the immune system in the first place. And that is exactly what inflammation is. It is a process that's initiated to help the body rid itself of something that does not belong there. That's the long and short of it. The process itself, as I say, is uncomfortable. Number one, because it brings on a set of symptoms that are characteristic of inflammation. In the old school of medicine, way back, they used the Latin. In fact, in old medicine, they used lots of Latin. Hence, if you were going to become a doctor, then in your pre-studies, you needed to study Latin because there was so much Latin used. About the only place today that it's used much is in anatomy and physiology. And now all the anatomical parts of the body were originally named in Latin, and hence when early doctors studied medicine, they studied Latin. so that they could pronounce the various parts of the body. And it became international. That means that no matter where in the world you went, if you studied anatomy, you were going to learn the Latin names of all the organs in the body. Now, in most cases, each language has developed their own names, sometimes based on the Latin, sometimes entirely different. You know, for us, for example, we have a major organ in the body that does all kinds of things to keep us alive and make everything work, and that's the liver. But in Latin, it's hepar. And so when you think of liver or you read something with hepar on it, it doesn't connect as well, simply because most people are not aware of that unless you studied medicine or some of the healing arts, anatomy, physiology, whatever, then you would have run across the term. But we always refer to it as liver, and so in each language, like in German, it's Leber. And so it's interesting, and when I did all my studies in Germany, the Germans had their own names for things as well as the Latin names. And then, of course, I had the English names. So if I were talking about liver, it would be liver in English, Leber in German, and hepar in Latin. And a lot of the organs retained at least some derivative of that in their term, and some did not, and as in our case, we did not. So it's interesting that the old explanation in medicine had Latin terms, and those Latin terms for inflammation. Now remember, I've said before that inflammation is redness, heat, swelling, and pain. Those are the four signs of inflammation. Now, originally it was rhubarb, calor, tumor, and dolor. Rhubarb meaning red, calor meaning hot or heat, tumor meaning swelling, and dolor meaning pain. And so when you studied medicine, that's the terms you had to learn in the old system. Today, it's pretty much been abolished outside of anatomy. And so consequently, you will find that you just don't hear the terms anymore. And so, also, as a consequence, Latin in most schools isn't offered, although I understand a few have started it again, but not because you had to have it for medicine, because you can go through the whole subject of medicine and outside learning the names of tissues and organs in Latin. That's about the only touch of it you will have, and of course we don't even call it that way. We don't tell our patients about their hepar, we tell them about their liver. And inflammation then became a series of symptoms that were uncomfortable. You know, nobody likes to see a big red area or feel heat there, or see it swell up or feel pain there. And so we don't like it, it's uncomfortable. Now, in a few cases, there's a fifth symptom, which is fever, and that's if your body has really encountered something very toxic, especially viruses, which are pieces of toxic material. The body may mobilize fever in the process, and that accelerates everything, because when you raise the body heat, you accelerate metabolism, and of course things like viruses, which are protein in nature, will end up coming apart because, as you will know maybe, proteins fall apart in the presence of heat. That's why we cook things like meat, is that it causes the bonds to break apart in the big protein molecules and reduces them to smaller pieces that the body can digest easier. So that's the whole idea of cooking, of course, is to break things down. And so the body, in the process of getting rid of a virus, will in many cases raise the heat way up, and we think that's terrible, so medicine has devised chemicals that will shut off all these symptoms. And antibiotics happens to be one of them. Of course, steroids, there's a lot of steroids being used. There's antipyretic drugs, fever drugs, they're called, that will reduce fevers or reduce inflammation, the whole process. And of course, when you do that, you feel better. But if you understand the process of inflammation and what the purpose of it is, you may not be so anxious to shut it down. Those symptoms, as I say, can become very uncomfortable, especially if there's a lot of swelling, pressing against sensory nerves, which can give you pain. And basically that's the cause of the pain from inflammation, is if it happens to be pressing on sensory nerves, then of course you have that sensation of pain and it's not comfortable. The problem is that the process itself is very important, and that's why our body has chosen to do that. And we like to think that it's our enemy, and of course it isn't. Now, when the body is unable to liberate something, which is what inflammation does, two things. It helps to neutralize or break down toxic substances and aids in the removal of them. So the reason, of course, is that when we have an inflammatory process initiated, it means that we have encountered something that the body considers to be an enemy or a threat or a problem. And so the first thing it does, it triggers a cascade of various messengers that initiate certain processes. And one is that it triggers a cell called the basophil to release histamine. And histamine causes dilation of the blood vessels and hence allows a lot more blood cells, both white and red, to come into the area, which usually then also it attracts lymph. And so by bringing more blood in and more lymph, the tissue swells. Okay, so now you, with the more heat and redness, then you're going to have the swelling, and with the swelling can come pain depending on where the process is taking place. But in any case, they are not comfortable, and so people don't like that. And so we have been content over the years to accept as diagnosis a whole array of terms that in the word itis, I-T-I-S. When you study medical vocabulary, you get all these itises. You have bronchitis. Oh, well, now I know what I have. Well, what do you have? Well, the bronchial area is inflamed. Well, why is it inflamed? Well, we don't know, but it's inflamed, and it's uncomfortable, and we're going to give you something that's going to turn that off. And we have tonsillitis, we have sinusitis, we have colitis, we have pleuritis. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. But when you really get down to it, that is not a diagnosis, that is a description. It's a description of a symptom that something is wrong. Okay, so why do my tonsils keep inflaming? And therefore I have tonsillitis. Well, I don't know, but it's inflamed. Medicine has not been very good at pinpointing causes. Now, if they want to just put you off, they'll say, oh, well, maybe you have strep throat. Well, now we've talked about strep in the throat before, and the fact is streptococcus live in the throat all the time, and hence strep isn't the cause. Okay, well then, what is the cause? Well, the cause is there's something in the body that has accumulated that has gotten into the lymphatics, because the tonsils are lymph nodes in the lymphatics, that the body wants to get rid of. And so how does it do that? It initiates an inflammatory process. So what happens? The tonsils get real red, they swell up, they hurt like crazy sometimes, and so we don't like that. And so what do? We want to rush in and get something that will shut that down. So what do we get? Most often we're going to get antibiotics. And we're going to probably get some type of an antipyretic to reduce fever if we have fever, and or inflammation in general. And there are drugs that shut the process down. Now, depending on what it is and where it is, they have some other ancillary drugs that they might add to the process in order to beat down those symptoms so that you're going to feel better. And so what happens is, as we shut all of that off, all of those symptoms, redness, heat, swelling, and pain, and sometimes fever, it all disappears, and we feel better. Now, why were we feeling bad? Well, first of all, we didn't like the feeling of the inflammation, number one. And number two, what we don't think about too often is that the body has energy that it uses for all the various processes. Okay, so there are processes of digestion, elimination, rebuilding, defending, and movement, and so forth, that all require energy. And so when we have a process going on like this, we have to truck in energy to that area where the body is inflaming. And so when it does that, guess what? We feel tired. We feel draggy. And hence that can become another symptom depending on our energy reserves. And that's for another time. We've talked about that some, and we've talked about the fact that the body's like a battery, and that there's electrical currents, proticity and electricity moving through the body, causing all kinds of things to happen, and that in the mitochondria of the body is where we build little tiny storage units of energy called ATP that are held until we need them, and in the process of cracking off or breaking off the third phosphate high energy bond, we release the energy that was encapsulated to hold it together, and hence that energy is available to be used. So energy can be in various forms. One can be heat, but there's other forms it can be in. And so once we are engaged in something, the body is going to pull a lot of energy into that area, and hence the feeling of dragginess or tiredness. And so bottom line is, we may not feel very good, especially if we don't have a lot of energy reserves to begin with, when the body initiates a significant inflammation process to get rid of something. Now, if you go back and look at homotoxicology, you're going to find that there are a series of phases that the body can go through in getting sick or getting well. They basically fall into two major groups of three. One more toward the acute side, which means new things that have just come into the body and the body is trying to get rid of, and chronic issues where now the cells of the body are being disturbed. So we could well say that on the one side, if you look at one of the charts called homotoxicology, and if you go and look at the video of homotoxicology, and if you really want to study it in detail, we have available DVDs of those broadcasts and some charts and reference material to go with it that goes into much more detail, so you can really get a good understanding of it. But for all practical purposes, you have a group of three phases on the humoral, meaning in the fluids of the body, side, and the cellular side, which is where the more serious problems take place. And the serious ones can be caused by repeated repression of the acutes. Now, I don't know if that clicked or not. That means if you suppress things over and over with antibiotics and or steroids or whatever the drug of choice that you get prescribed, we deposit this material into the tissue of the body, intermingling or surrounding the cells, called the matrix of the body. We keep depositing that, and that's one of the phases, is deposition. And so when we get to that point that we are depositing the poisons shut down because the immune process was shut down, we began to accumulate a toxic burden in the body. And if we get too much of it, a lot of it then can infiltrate into the cells And once that starts to take place, we cross a barrier between the outside of the cells versus inside the cells, and that means that those toxic materials start to accumulate inside the cells, and that's the impregnation phase. That means we're now starting to put poisons inside the cells, which becomes much more serious and much more dangerous, and out of that we then began to develop chronic problems, because now with a load of poison in the cell that it cannot get rid of, we have a serious problem. That means that it's going to interfere with the chemistry of the cells, and many of the cells that are now poisoned are going to begin to malfunction. If the condition continues, it goes into something called degenerative phases. That means that the chemistry is disturbed much more seriously. And if that still continues without any relief, meaning that we somehow have triggered the cells to dump those poisons back out and the body to get rid of them, they can penetrate into the nucleus of the cell, and now we have a very serious problem that is called the neoplastic phases and or de-differentiation phases. What that means is that the cell can become mutated, disconnect from the body, and become a mutant cell, and we know what that means, tumors or cancer. Now, what am I saying? I'm saying continued suppression of things over on the acute side or the humoral side can lead to degeneration and to serious degenerative problems on the cellular side. So as we move toward that right side of the chart, which you would see if you go back and look at the broadcast, we move to that right side of the chart. That is progressive illness. We're getting deeper, sicker. And the mid phase, as I said, on the acute side or the humoral side is phase number 2, which is inflammation. That's where all the itises occur. Okay, now why am I telling you all this? I don't know if you realize it or not, and maybe you've already drawn the conclusion that a high percentage of the things that people go to medicine for is to get some type of drugs to shut down the inflammatory process, those itises. Now, if you go to the doctor and you tell him what's wrong, he looks in your throat and you say, well, what do I have? He says, well, you have tonsillitis. He's really told you nothing, but it sounds very impressive. Well, now the doctor knows what's wrong. I don't have to worry, and he's going to give me the pills or the shot or both that's going to take care of it. And so what I'm doing, I'm giving you information that I think is life-saving, because down the road with continued suppression, all you're going to do is to lay the groundwork for serious degenerative processes in the body. Now, the deceptive thing about all of this, and I don't think I can emphasize that enough, the deceptive thing about all this is that it's a slow process. As a rule, there's a few exceptions. There's exceptions where when you suppress, and I've seen this happen, when you suppress a flu, which is a virus, with very strong antibiotics, you can drive that into the heart. And I've known of people's heart to quit, or the heart rate dropped down to almost nothing, because the nerve that regulates the heartbeat was now affected by the virus being driven into the heart. And the person either could die, or in many cases they've been given a pacemaker to speed the heart back up because the nerve was so damaged. And what was the cause? The cause was the suppression of the virus and the body inflammatory process of getting rid of the virus, and hence we have now damaged the heart as a part of the process. Now, if you chose the right therapy, if you were going to pick a therapy, it would intensify the body's inflammatory process, but accelerate it so that your body could get rid of it faster, and hence you would be done with it. Now, as I've said, The inflammatory phase is that middle of the three phases on the humoral or acute side, and if you successfully neutralize the poisons by the inflammatory process, then the body moves to the left and excretes them out. And the excretory phase is the resolution phase, which means, okay, now we have neutralized this stuff, we're going to secrete it out of the body, get rid of it, and it's all done. Now, how does it secrete it? It can do it through the urine, can do it through the bowel, can do it through the lungs, it can do it through the skin. Those are all ways that it can get rid of it, or any other process. Mucous membrane, it can get rid of it through mucous membrane. Any process in the body that takes things to the surface can be the route that the body chooses to move these poisons out once they're neutralized. And that's what inflammation does. Now, that then, to me, makes inflammation a very critical phase in the whole process. Extremely critical. I don't think I can emphasize it enough. How many times are children rushed back into their family doctor to get more antibiotics because a throat inflammation has returned? Now, or an ear inflammation has returned, or a bronchial inflammation has returned. Why does it return? Because if it wasn't taken care of initially, and or you have a generator in the body generating poisons, and that's a possibility because of another problem. But in any case, if those poisons were not liberated the first time that your body initiated this process, then guess what? When it builds enough impetus, more energy, it's going to attempt the same process again. And hence the tonsils are going to swell up again. Now again, you need to keep in mind that tonsils are lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are part of the lymphatic system where the more toxic things move through to be neutralized before it's emptied back into the blood because it could be too toxic for the blood. And so the lymph nodes are the gatekeepers of the lymphatics because at some point the lymph empties back into the blood to go to the liver for final detoxing. If it gets into the blood, that's where it's going to go. So the body will not allow that to happen because if you initiate a massive inflammation inside the blood, it's called sepsis, and the body is tremendously challenged with that type of process. So the body will preserve that from happening by closing the gate of a lymph node if it's extremely toxic and doing more active immune work, i.e. white cells, lymphocytes and phagocytes, to break it down before it empties into the blood, because all the major lymphatics of the body ultimately get into two major ducts, and those two major ducts empty into the bloodstream underneath the collarbone, which is called the subclavian vein. And so it's not going to allow it to happen if those lymph vessels are full of very toxic material. It's not going to go directly into the blood until the level of toxicity has been reduced by the lymph nodes. The tonsils, being lymph nodes, are part of that process. Now, how do we deal with that with regular medicine? Well, if you keep having those flare-ups, tonsillitis, and sometimes calling it strep throat. If the doctor wants to be really dramatic, he can say, oh, well, I think you have strep throat. Well, the strep is always there, and it's part of the process that sometimes the poisons are so bad that by pinocytosis, the lymph nodes will push the poison out to the surface, and the strep living in your throat will digest it to break it down into a harmless byproduct. Now, I hope that's beginning to click. So, every time you suppress it, you stop the process. The body did not get rid of something it was attempting to get rid of, and it will regroup and later come right back again. I've had people come into my office and say, oh, my kid has to go in every month with bronchitis or an ear flare-up or whatever. And why is it? Because there's actually a cycle in the body over a 23-day period of time called a body biorhythm. And part of that is that part of that rhythm cycle, the body tries to dump stuff out to get it out of the body. And so it can initiate the inflammatory process again. So then what do? You run in and you get some more antibiotics and some more anti-fever maybe, or whatever they're going to give you, because the more intense the response is, meaning depending on how toxic the toxins are, the more intense that inflammation is going to be. And in some cases, as I say, you may develop a fever because the body's really serious about getting this stuff out. And whatever it is, that's the problem, not the inflammation. And I'm hoping this is starting to make some sense, because I've seen over the years, first of all, every year we prescribe tons of antibiotics. And we spend billions of dollars. And as the body tries harder to save itself from becoming seriously ill down the road, the more powerful the antibiotics have to be. Now, part of the process is, yeah, you might kill off some strep, but the strep wasn't the problem because it was there all the time. But something is going on in the body, and medicine is either not equipped, nor are they going to take the time to find out what it is. And you're going to be satisfied by hearing, oh, you have tonsillitis or you have strep throat. Oh, okay. And so everything is fine. And so if they give you enough of it, it will keep suppressing it. But guess what? There's some cases where that won't happen. It just won't be repressed. It is so poisonous, the body says, we got to get this stuff out. And we're going to keep hitting it until we get it out of the body. And you're saying, well, boy, we got to stop this because it's miserable and it might be dangerous, and we've got to suppress this stuff. So we got to get more antibiotics and more fever and more whatever, more anti-inflammatories in general. And hence, we keep the battle going. So when it finally won't give up, when the body wants to preserve itself, what do? Well, I think we better just take those tonsils out. So what do? We aren't going to have that symptom anymore because we're going to cut it out. If we couldn't suppress it enough, we'll just chop it out of there and then it'll be all over. But is it all over? No, of course not. Why do you think the body has tonsils? Just because it had an empty space and said we got to fill them with something, so let's put some little sacs in there called tonsils or lymph nodes, and that'll fill up a space. Now, I don't really believe that's why it's there. I'm a person who believes every piece in the body was put there over the thousands and millions of years as a part of the process so that our body can live. And us being still around on this earth is fairly good proof that it works relatively well. Now, I know there are times it could potentially become overcome, and the body's so weak that we can't handle it. Now, there's a lot of issues with that, because behind all of this is another problem. And we need to talk about that a minute. And that is that the body's ability to take care of itself is based on its nutritional status. Now, I don't know if that clicked or not. The body's ability to take care of itself is based on its nutritional status. All of the processes in the body require a lot of things to work together to keep the body clean and healthy and highly energized. Okay, but for all of that to happen, there are certain requirements nutritionally that the body must have to make it work. Now, on and off, we've mentioned various aspects, but this is one of those broadcasts where I'm synthesizing. I'm wanting to bring together a lot of different things so that you begin to see that everything is working with everything else. You know, a sore throat or a tonsillitis, as medicine might call it, is not an isolated event. It is a part of a process. There's always processes going on in the body, but in order for those to work properly, we have to have the right nutrients, and especially the key portion of that are the minerals, the elements. The body has to have the elements. For those who think in terms of the Bible, and it says that man was made from the dust of the ground, that means basically the elements of the ground, then they all have a purpose, or else they wouldn't be put there. And so we, as a product of the ground, at least our body, then we have all those elements, and all those elements have purposes. Now, I have to say that medicine has not discovered them yet. In fact, you know, it's been a very slow process of even finding out about vitamins. And we were forced into finding those out because of gross deficiencies of people like sailors who were so grossly deficient in certain things that it was finally discovered that if you supplied those, it stopped the problem from developing. And so those were deficiency type illnesses. But we think today, oh well, you know, we got plenty to eat, so we don't have any of that. Well, that's an assumption based on the fact as to whether the ground has those present. So that presents another issue. So I'm hoping that you're beginning to see how this all comes together. Now, I mentioned before, and I will mention again, the elements are cofactors. Magnesium, calcium, manganese, zinc, copper, and strontium, and molybdenum, and all of these different elements all work together as cofactors in the body. Some also become a part of the structure, like calcium, but they all carry on other functions in the body, and without those elements, those functions cannot work. Many of them have to do with enzymes, and many of the enzymes, in order to do what they're supposed to do, either putting things together or breaking things apart, require cofactors of the elements with them to make them work. Now, that's a big problem, because the food is a mess today. Whether you know it or not, as I say, I came out of an era and grew up when all of the stuff that we're talking about today was not a major issue. It's become a major issue because we have a major problem. And that problem is we don't have nutritious food, and more often than not, it is actually missing all kinds of elements, many of which we still don't even know what they do in the body, but I'm absolutely convinced that every element that is out there in the periodic table that should be in our body and has a function in our body, whether we have developed the wherewithal to understand that yet. And over the years, more and more things have become important. In fact, the word vitamin comes from two words, vital amine. The name vitamin came because one researcher realized that these factors were important for the body to work right, and most of them had an amine base, and therefore they were vital amines, from which we derived the word vitamin. Now, I've had a request to talk about nutrients and vitamins and so forth, and we're going to be doing a broadcast on that coming soon, if not the next time, but very soon. And there is a lot to be known about vitamins and minerals, the vital amines and the minerals. Now, the minerals were one of the last things to be talked about because everybody was so enamored once we uncovered vitamins that those became the focal point. It's interesting about research, you know, it's like somebody opens the door and then all the researchers come whoosh, all crowding in to see how they can somehow get involved in the process once something is uncovered. But minerals were not considered so important for a long time, and it was just assumed that they were in the soil, and it was assumed that it was in the food, but it took later investigation to find out we're in big trouble because we're missing minerals. Now, I've mentioned that before, and I'll throw it in again because it's a part of this process, is that it was discovered, I would say in the 1800s, a bit about minerals by some doctors. And it wasn't till the early 1900s that the full connection was made. And that connection was made by a group of doctors who they were wondering, why are all of a sudden we're having all these degenerative problems in the body that weren't existing before? Like cardiovascular problems were not in the medical books because nobody had cardiovascular problems. It was usually an inherited or inborn structural problem with the heart. In other words, there was a genetic problem that the person came in with a defective heart. But all of these problems that we've been talking about and spend billions and billions of dollars on symptoms for every year did not exist. And it wasn't until they started to becoming more common in things like cancer and neurological degeneration and cardio and gastrointestinal problems and just on, diabetes. As these things started becoming more prevalent, there were some questioning doctors who said, now wait a minute, what's going on? Why is all this happening? Well, as they began to look into it, the astute doctors, now these are the physicians who were people who were practitioners of a healing art. They weren't part of the medical business or industry. They were actually people who went into medicine to help people get well. And so when people started getting unusually sick and the rate was going up, then they knew something wasn't right. They started looking. And so the key doctors who really looked into that began to realize, I wonder, if the diet has something to do with this. And so they started studying diet. And in the process of studying diet, they started studying food. And in the process of studying food, they started studying soil. And it all clicked. Now we know what the problem is that people are deficient. They're mineral deficient. And that set off a whole new approach, at least with some doctors. And as they started doing their studies, they found that, as I say, number one, the food was missing elements. It was minerally deficient. And then they stepped back a step further and found out the soil was deficient. And so what they started doing is they started changing that. And when they did, the people who were fed real food, their problems began to clear up. And so what they came to the realization was that all these degenerative problems that were coming about were deficiency diseases. They weren't pathological in the sense that something had attacked you, but they were missing elements that did not allow your body to function properly. And so bit by bit, the cells became less functional, and hence the system from which the cells are a part of also began to become non-functional. And so pretty soon, there was a big problem. And so when these doctors then started correcting some of this and people started getting well, there was a local writer back in the 1930s, who got onto this and wrote a big article about it, and he called it Modern Miracle Men. Now, I've mentioned it before, and so there was a gentleman who was so impressed with that he actually took a copy of this article and read it before the U.S. Senate. at that time, the senators were impressed by the article, and they ordered it be printed up in a government document called Modern Miracle Man. Government document 264, published in 1936. Now, of course, very rapidly it kind of faded off into the background, because at the same time that all this was happening, modern medicine was starting to synthesize drugs to manage all these deficiency symptoms. So consequently, the doctors kind of divided. The bulk of the doctors who were doing well, making a lot of money, treating people's deficiency symptoms, were not too much interested in changing their diet and making them well. They want to stop all that, so they actually ridiculed the doctors who were saying, look, these people are getting better from their cardiovascular issues and all these other problems because they're getting nutrients that they need, in particular the minerals. So at any rate, one doctor, Dr. Northern was his name, actually quit practicing medicine and devoted the rest of his life to promoting and in learning about the role of minerals and good soil and healthy food in one's life. Now, I'm saying all that to say that this whole idea that minerals were so important brought on a whole cascade of things, the FDA and a lot of things. What became the FDA, it was originally the Pure Food and Drug Act, and we've talked about that before, but the point is that whether you're going to develop degenerative problems because the cells are unable to function properly because they don't have the right key elements. Now, I'm tying all this together because if the cells have the right nutrients to carry out all the biochemical functions they need to carry out, that enables the body to, in most cases, deal with the outside toxins that come in. Now, I don't know if that clicked or not. If the body has the right key elements that will allow the immune system and everything to function properly, all the chemistry of the body's ability to deal with and eliminate the external toxins is improved tremendously. Therefore, you have less problems of accumulation of toxins, and you're going to have less of these recurring so-called inflammations or itises that people have, because the body has what it needs to do the job. And that affects immune function, it affects internal chemistry function. I mean, every cell has to have certain key elements for it to function properly. If it doesn't have those elements, it cannot function properly. Hence, the other problem that came up in that time that more of the doctors became aware of was something called toxemia, and that is the accumulation of toxins in the body. And so people's diet was being changed. They were being fed denatured food. The processing companies were totally adulterating the food in the process of making it available to package and to sit on shelves and so forth. So they had to kill the enzymes in it. They had to do a lot of things to it to make it have a long shelf life so it would be more profitable for them. And so they worked from that end of it, destroying food even further, even if it might have come from a good source. But because they were over packaging and selling all this stuff, they had to grow it faster and grow more of it. And so the soils became depleted. And then when the soils became depleted, the food became poor quality and sick. And the sicker the food became, the more the insects became a problem, because the insect's job is to get rid of plants that are sick. But we developed a solution to that. What we did is we saturated the sick plants with chemicals to try to kill the insects, and killed off and chased away the insects, and then fed the sick insect repellent plants to people. And then we wonder why we have a health problem. Now, as I say, it's always insidious. Things don't just stand up way up here above everything else by itself and say, here I am, here's the problem right here. It doesn't work that way. But all these things creep in bit by bit, and guess what the public does? The public adapts to all of this stuff. They adapt to it, and hence they allow it to become a problem. And they don't realize that it's a problem because it's very slow in developing, and so we just don't give it any thought. Now, I'm hoping this is kind of all coming together, and I'm hoping we can just tie it all up in this one broadcast, but I wanted to make it so emphatic that you understood what's going on, and it's your choice. I mean, I'm not here to tell you don't keep turning off the inflammations and go eat real food. Put your money in eating good real food instead of buying antibiotics and drugs and over-the-counter stuff, all the stuff that we do to try to take care of all these symptoms, because our body's inability is a big problem based on poor nutrition. So, but nobody wants to be bothered with the nutrition, and they don't want to be bothered with having to try to choose good food. And it's more convenient to go eat the junk food that has nothing in it, more like plastic and synthetics than real food. And of course, if they put enough salt, sugar, and bad fats in it, it doesn't taste too bad, and we get used to that taste, so that after a while, we think that's the way things should taste. And unfortunately, I still remember what real food tastes like. I grew up with real food, grown in real soil that was not depleted, and it was full of minerals, and it was dark, and when it turned over, it was full of earthworms, and when you took a bite of an apple from a tree, grown in good soil, full of minerals, it was sweet and juicy, and had this really nice apple flavor to it, and you could even hold it out away from your body and smell that aroma of a very nutritious apple or tomato or whatever it is. But see, that didn't lend itself to high profit, fast production, and it was easier to throw a few minerals in the soil, a few key minerals, and some nitrogen, and force the plant to grow so that it looks like a plant or a piece of fruit or whatever. And it was easier to do that, and faster and more profitable. So that's the direction it took. And as I say, each generation growing up, we just think, well, this is the way it is. We don't know there's any difference. I guess we're just supposed to be sick a lot, and we're just supposed to have all these chronic illnesses, and we're supposed to take all these drugs, and it's supposed to cost us a few $1 trillion a year to pay the bill for all this. And when the organs begin to fail because of malnutrition and overburden of poisons that the body's unable to get rid of, which, if it's working right, and these old doctors, I've mentioned before, Dr. Tilden, John Tilden, MD, out of Colorado, he treated people for years. The first several years of his medical practice, he used the regular medical treatment with the drugs, and he came to the realization that wasn't a problem. We didn't have to shut down all the symptoms. We need to correct the body so it doesn't produce all this. And so he called it toxemia, which was the accumulation of poisons. Fortunately, the area he lived, out in Colorado, near all the Rocky Mountains, the soil was much better, and so nutrition was not as much of a problem as a lot of the environmental poisons that were starting to accumulate, and the going to public water supplies, and a lot of things that happened. And of course, more and more people starting to take so-called medicines instead of figuring out that their body was deficient, and the other changes that were coming about at that time, and there were a pile of them. But it was easier for him. But now we have the nutritional problem on top of the toxemia problem, and we have a worse toxemia problem than he could have ever dreamed of. there were some things out there at the time. And of course, there's another issue. The body itself produces certain toxins as byproducts, and with the right nutrition, the body can eliminate all that stuff and it's no longer an issue. But cells do die when they wear out, and they need to be broken down and gotten rid of. And there's a lot of things going on that the body needs to handle, and it can if it has the proper nutrition. But those minerals, and we're going to do a major broadcast on minerals one of these days. We'll probably mention it to a degree when we talk about nutrients in general, and of course the supplements. But all of this brought on a crisis that these doctors in the 20s and 30s and 40s saw happening, and they tried to offset those. And we've mentioned about Dr. Royal Lee before, who was an important researcher in nutrition, and when he realized that people are going to eat terrible food because all the commercial food is being adulterated, either in the growth process being deficient or the manufacturing and packaging process is finally destroyed, so that what we're doing is taking and eating a imitation food, not real food, and without the key elements in the body, we're going to get sick. And so he's the first person to come out with a multiple nutrient product way back in the 20s, actually. He came up with the first one for his own family, and his wife did very well, and his kids. And so people they knew saw how well they were doing, and they said, well, what are you taking? And they told him, and they said, well, can we get some of that? And so bit by bit, he was urged to start producing this. So he set up a company to make the first multiple nutrient product. I'm not going to call it a multiple vitamin, but it's a multiple nutrient. It was made from organically grown products, and it had all the broad spectrum of things that key nutrients that your body needs so that it can function properly. And as a consequence, he had to fight the FDA, the medical establishment, but fortunately, I've mentioned him before, he was a brilliant man, and he invented a lot of things that made him enough money to live on, that gave him the time to do all the research he did. So when he set up a company to make this product, I've heard people today say, well, he only did it to make money. Well, when he set the company up, he set himself on a salary of $1 per year, which is all he took the rest of his life from that company. The rest of the money went back into research and developing more and more high-quality products. He had 1,000 acres of land up in Wisconsin that had high minerals and had been certified organic over the years and still is, from which they make the products. And so I have to laugh when people say, well, he just did it to make money. Well, he didn't make any money off of it. In fact, he spent a pile of money fighting the FDA and the medical establishment to even get the products on the market. And so I would say that he was not only a brilliant man, but he was a humanitarian, because he didn't have to do that. He didn't have to put up with all that. He actually had enough money, he could have done nothing the rest of his life from his inventions, the royalties he made off of it, because he's the one that developed the stable drill so that when people's teeth were being drilled, it maintained its speed and it wasn't as painful as when it slowed down and dug into the tooth. And a lot of other things he invented, even for the military and so forth. He invented some things that those all made him more than enough money to live on. And so he didn't even have to practice dentistry, although he was trained in it, went to dental school. But he was just a man who was way ahead of his time and had a lot of foresight down the road. And he's the one that developed the protomorphogen concept that I mentioned about, or at least made it very practical. And it still exists today to rebuild organs and to help the body rebuild itself. But he never got any accolades from the scientific community. They tried to shut him down. the medical establishment and the government tried to shut him down constantly, but he was able to withstand all of that, finance it himself, and still put out products that help people gain their health. And some of the early doctors who realized what he had and realized that people were going to eat the trash food, I call it garbage food because there's nothing in it, and what is in it is more chemicals, preservatives, and flavor enhancers, and bad fats, but a lot of sodium chloride, not salt, not real salt, but the chemical sodium chloride, and a lot of bad oils. And that's what people have acclimated themselves to, that's what they developed a taste for, and that's what they want today. So it's interesting to me that people on one level know they're eating garbage. I'd say most people on one level know that they're eating garbage. But I think it's interesting to me how people will talk about a piece of junk food and then have this laugh about it, like, yeah, we know it's bad for us, we know it can kill us, but it sure tastes good. And they laugh and go ahead and eat anyhow. And that particular laugh, I think, is interesting because it comes out of transactional analysis when somebody knows that their behavior is destroying their life, but they continue to do it anyhow, and every time they do it, they kind of have that laugh about it when they just say, well, I know this, every time I light this cigarette, it's another nail in my coffin, he, and that he was referred to as the gallows laugh. You know you're hanging yourself, but you go ahead and do it anyhow. And so most people know that they're eating garbage food. Then I suppose there's a few people that don't know it. They just think anything that looks like food must be food. But nonetheless, most people realize that, and every time they eat a piece of garbage, they know they're eating garbage, and then they kind of want to relieve the tension of somebody saying, "Are you eating that garbage?" And so they say, "Well, I know it's not good for me, he, but it sure tastes good," and they go ahead and eat anyhow. But they don't have to do the gallows laugh, even though they're hanging themselves. All they need to do is say, "Do I want to be healthy or not? If I want to be in my latter years, riding a rascal electric chair around and dragging behind me a tank of oxygen and call it living," I mean, they can do that. That's the nice thing about a free society, is you're free to kill yourself if you want to. That was decided more often than not in courts, although you don't hear it talked about too much. But in Texas, I know when a judge heard a case related to acupuncture in Texas, there were people who wanted acupuncture, but the medical people didn't want to do it, but they didn't want anybody else doing it, so they blocked a license for licensing people that were trained to do it, and it ended up that citizens went together and took it to federal court, and the federal judge ruled, we have the freedom for the type of treatment that we want. And she said, we have a right to make our own decisions, and we have a right to make bad decisions too. It is our right. If we choose not to make an informed decision, but make a bad decision, we have that right. So they ruled that the medical people could not block. In fact, the state had to make the license available because citizens of that state wanted it. And they had that right. And so we do. We have the right. We can pour anything junky in our body that we want to. And I don't think the government has a right to not allow you to do it. Now, they have a right for a company who's putting out deceptive products or products that are known to be harmful dramatically. They have a right to regulate that. But they don't have a right to stop you from eating what you want to eat. And so my feeling is people come to me and they want me to tell them you can't eat that. And I say, well, here's what happens if you do, and here's what happens if you don't. But it's your choice. Because I'm not going to become the person that's going to try to, every time I see you, beat you up. You should be doing this or you shouldn't. If you come to me as an adult and you want me to tell you how to be healthy, and I tell you what I know that I believe has the capability of making you healthy, and you want to do it, well, that's your choice. I mean, I'm not going to push you into it, and I'm not going to become responsible for you, but then if you don't do it and you get sick, you must be willing to accept the consequences that you made the decision. And so, as I say, we've in some respects become kind of a hedonistic nation. we want to do what we want to do, and we want to do what we enjoy, and we'll worry about the consequences later, and if that's the choice, then that's okay. So I hope I've kind of opened up your eyes a little bit on this inflammation thing. And as I say, you should go back and look at the homotoxicology videos I did. And as I say, if you want to get really serious about it, you want to get the DVDs and get the written material that goes along, that goes much more in depth, so that you really understand the process and why it's important that you know what you're doing every time you suppress something. Now, I'm not saying under every circumstance that there could not be, as Dr. Glasser said, there might be once or twice in someone's life because of very unusual circumstances that it might be warranted to take an antibiotic, but we take it like candy. And most doctors, that's their standby treatment. You go in, probably the bulk of the things you go in for, they're going to shoot you an antibiotic, an anti-inflammatory, a painkiller, all of these things to manage the symptoms of inflammation, but they're not going to be finding out why you have the inflammation, and they're not going to be helping you to help your body do what it needs to do to become healthy. After all, if you're in the sick business, you want people feeling better for a while, but then getting sick again and coming back, because that's called practice building. And I'm not saying that every doctor is like that, and I'm not saying there's nothing in medicine that's useful. There are. If you're in a bad accident, you want the best emergency medicine doctor there is to treat you, because that's what he's good at, and that's what you need at the time. But then you're probably going to want to clean all that garbage out of your body that he had to make use of to get you through the crisis. And it could happen with some other. And if you abuse your body so badly that the organs are falling apart or some tissue is going, you may have to have some surgeon cut it out. And so then the question is, who earned it? And if you earned it, then you should be willing to live with the consequences of it. But otherwise, you should become informed, and you should understand your body, and you should understand how it works, and you should understand what type of thing you want to do. Now, I'm just going to throw in real fast before we close. I mentioned Dr. Hans-Heinrich Rechenfeld, that was the originator of the concept of homotoxicology, although he wasn't the first one, because Dr. Tilden, I mentioned, knew that toxemia was a big problem. He just didn't have it well organized, so it was easy to understand the process, but he knew what he was wanting to do and why he was doing it. But Rechenfeld, being a medical doctor, that's what he was trained in first, said that every year in the winter in Germany, he had patients who developed pneumonia, which is really, pneumonia itself is not a disease. Pneumonia is a process of your body getting rid of poisons and creating them into a fluid form that your body can excrete out and get rid of. It can cough it out and get it out of there. But of course, if you turn off the cough and you stop the process, then you're poisoning your lungs, and down the road, probably, I'm not saying smoking is good for you, but I'm sure that's not the only factor in developing lung cancer. But at any rate, Dr. Rechenfeld said, when I did regular medicine, every year, in spite of the antibiotics, in spite of all the medicine we had, I always had a few people with pneumonia die. But he said, once I learned how the body works and what the process is, and learned homeopathic medicine, because then he ended up and went on and studied homeopathic medicine, he said with 3 different single remedies, every year anybody who had pneumonia, which is the process of the body trying to clear the lungs, with those 3 remedies, he could help everybody resolve whichever ones they needed, or in some sequence if they needed. He could help them clear their lungs, and no one died with pneumonia after he learned how to utilize homeopathic medicine and understood the process of what was going on in the body. I've seen similar things like that happen. We've had people that were having all these problems, and once we cleared it up, especially kids, they went for years and never did have it again, whether it was ears or throat, excuse me, or whatever. They didn't have it again. Now, I had throat issues when I was young. I would periodically have those throat issues, but once I learned about what I do and cleared my body out, I haven't had a sore throat in probably 50-some years. And because there's no accumulated poison that the body has to try to get out of there. and that's the whole process. So I hope that this is going to be an inspiration to you, to at least to learn a lot more about how your body works, and especially about the inflammatory process, and find out that it really is the path to health. That's why your body inflames. In fact, any process that it initiates has a purpose, because all the things that happen in your body are goal-oriented. They're for a purpose to carry out something. And so even though temporarily you may not feel good, like if you eat poisoned food, your body's going to vomit it out, and or diarrhea it out, or both, depending on how toxic it is. Now, is the vomiting bad? Do you want to then take something to stop the vomiting, or do you want to help the body in the process of clearing it out? And so in true natural medicine, because there's people in natural medicine try to manage inflammation the same as there are in regular medicine, because they have accepted the medical model. All they want to do is try to use natural products to carry out the same thing, and think maybe, well, the side effects may not be as bad. But you know, there are herbs that can kill somebody the same as there are drugs that can kill somebody if they're overused or abused. And so if a true healer understands the whole process of the body and how it gets sick, how it gets well, and how you can either aid it or disrupt it in that process, and also what the consequences are if you do. It was nice being with you again. I hope I gave you something to chew on a little bit. As I say, each time we try to refine, get into a little bit more detail, and try to connect it with more things so that you get the bigger picture of understanding what it means to be healthy or sick. So until our next broadcast, visit our website, mindyourhealthcast.com, and also we want you to be healthy.